So JNCC has a number of partnerships with many of you, which I'm sure you're aware of, listed on the left here, to run the biodiversity recording schemes that are listed on the right. The Terrestrial Evidence Partnership of Partnerships, or TEPoP, was created to bring together all of our partners, and was intended to be a mechanism to share guidance and facilitate communication across us all. So the underlying principle of TEPoP is one of collaboration and knowledge exchange, and it has the anticipated benefits of enhancing and developing efficient and effective joint working. So then the Terrestrial Surveillance Development and Analysis Partnership, or TSDA, slightly less of a mouthful, is comprised of JNCC, UKCEH and BTO, and this partnership undertakes various cross-cutting work across TEPoP. So projects undertaken by TSDA can broadly be classified into development work and analytical work. Analytical work includes work within various themes, including those looking at predictive modelling and development of new metrics using the species data that we collect within the TEPoP schemes. So please do get in touch with us if you want to hear more about any of the analytical work that TSDA have undertaken. But today we'll be hearing about two strands of TSDA development work. So the first of these is led by Rob Robinson at BTO, and it's considering the potential for volunteers to record habitat information within TEPoP schemes. Then the second part of the webinar will be led by Michael Pocock from UKCEH, and this will discuss his work on volunteer retention and participation in citizen science.
Excellent, thank you everybody for coming along. I want to talk to you today just a little bit about some thinking that we've been doing on whether and how we might get volunteers, specifically volunteers participating in biodiversity recording schemes, recording habitats, which is often a useful thing to want to do. And I think one of the first questions that we have to ask is, what do we mean by habitat? And of course, habitat is one of those words that means different things to different people. So some people, on seeing the photograph that is in front of us, might focus on perhaps the percentage cover of grassland and that you can see in the foreground, or they might think that habitat refers to the presence of a particular species, such as the juniper that's slightly behind it, if the species that they're interested in are perhaps juniper specialists. Or they might think about other specific features, such as the presence of dead wood. Or some people, when they talk about habitat, might think slightly larger scale. So they might think about the difference between improved and unimproved grassland, such as you can see in the front of this photograph, or possibly between woodland and upland habitats further back. So when we're thinking about habitat, we always have to bear in mind what do we mean, and recognise that different folks in different schemes, I guess, might have different requirements. And as a result of this, there have been a large number of attempts to classify habitat over the years, and this is just an example of 3 that are used for different TEPoP schemes, and just 2 different example habitats here, a woodland habitat and a grassland habitat. And you can see at the most of the schemes tend to be hierarchical, so they classify at a number of different levels, and at the top level there's reasonably broad agreement between the different classification schemes there, in the sense they're all using words that refer to roughly the same thing. But as you get further down the hierarchy, then things start to differ depending on the particular features that each scheme perhaps is emphasizing, whether it's the presence of particular features, as in the BBS scheme, or the presence of particular species, such as in the National Plant Monitoring Scheme in the middle there, or perhaps more community-oriented, vegetation-oriented classification, such as in the UNIS scheme on the right there. And I think we have to bear in mind also what it's like to be a volunteer to record habitat. And I think this is one of the things certainly our volunteers perhaps struggle with. So if you're towards the back of this photograph in the middle of the woodland, then perhaps recording habitat is relatively straightforward. But how do you record in a simple way the habitat if you're perhaps somewhere in the middle of the foreground of this photo? Is it grassland or is it woodland? Which features do you want to focus on? How important is the presence of the houses or the town in the background there, and also the lake water features? So volunteers often have to make sort of on the spot decisions as to what features they should record in the boxes that they're given, and sometimes without clear guidance, this can be really tricky for them, is to know which features to prioritize and which features are sort of most relevant. So any recording scheme needs to sort of give clear direction, I think, in terms of what they want volunteers and how they want them to record it. Sometimes it can be really quite difficult, particularly in sort of the British landscapes where habitats are often really small scale. But taking a step back, why record habitat in the first place? Well, the first and most obvious one, perhaps, is to basically sort of identify and measure habitat extent. Knowing how much habitat we have, particularly of some of the sort of the scarcer habitats, is probably quite an important thing. And then simply also sort of measuring change in that extent, or change in condition. And those of you who've seen the UK Hab, the European Union report on habitat condition will know how important that is, that came out today. Looking at species horticology, so often a fairly fundamental thing, and perhaps the most divergent of things that we might want to measure, since each species requires different features of the habitat. More broadly, we might want to characterize and understand environmental drivers of change, so how habitats are changing and the impacts that has on species. And finally, perhaps an important point might be to enable sampling to be stratified, so that we can actually look at changes in biodiversity in particular habitats. So these are just a few of the things that we've thought of. I'd be interested to hear whether anybody has any other reasons why we might want to record habitat. And obviously, recording habitat can be done in a range of different ways, ranging from purely sort of remote sensed data, whether it be satellites or drones or LiDAR or any of the other sort of technologies that are coming through, all the way through to sort of actually having people on the ground, whether they're volunteers participating in schemes or whether they're paid professionals. And obviously, these two things don't exist in isolation, and often benefits can be had by combining them. So, for instance, there's increasing interest in using crowdsourced or online participation to sort of validate Earth observation data. And sometimes we might want to think about using volunteers to proactively ground truthing, so actually sending them out into the field with predetermined information. And a previous report has looked in some detail at this. The link is at the bottom of the screen there for those who want to follow it up. But basically, they looked at the potential for volunteers to validate the Norfolk Living Map, which is basically a landscape map of Norfolk, and the square here happens to be the habitat parcels in the south end of Norwich, close to where I live. And they considered a number of things that you might want to think about in terms of how you might get volunteers to validate some of the automated classifications that had been done. And one of the things that they did was they asked a range of user groups how, or representatives of user groups, how appealing they would find different approaches to validating this map. And the sort of the results are shown on the right-hand side here, where sort of the lighter colors represent sort of not very appealing, and the darker colors represent more appealing. And I think there are two things to get from this. One of which is that people would be much more interested in validating data that came from their own areas that they were familiar with, that they lived in, rather than sort of being given perhaps a random area to sort of validate without having that background knowledge. In the same way that we might do with sort of offer BBS people a sort of a random square to go survey, for instance. So we might, that might suggest that actually there's a different pool of volunteers out there who might be more interested in this sort of thing. So people who are interested more in their local community, more in the things that are going on around them, rather than the sort of the more species-oriented or taxa-oriented approach that some of the biodiversity schemes take. So there's potentials for expanding the volunteer pool, if you like. And the second one of which is that people generally found sort of going out into the field and doing things sort of on the ground, as it were, perhaps more appealing than sitting behind a computer desk reviewing satellite images or aerial photographs. So there's a whole wealth of information there in terms of how volunteers might interact with Earth observation data and improve it. It's well worth a read. But going back to sort of the task in hand, if you like, how do we encourage or motivate volunteers to record habitat? How do we want them to be standing out in a field like this? And there's a number of things that will make habitat recording more or less appealing to volunteers, and some of them are sort of summarized here. Some will relate to the relationship with the existing recording activity. So if the habitat recording can take place during existing visits on the left here, then volunteers are perhaps more likely to do it than if it requires a separate trip. Similarly, if it's closely linked to their motivation, so there's a direct relevance to the species that or the taxa they're recording, then that might make them more motivated to do it than if it was something that was seen as completely separate. And then there are things to do with the sort of the habitat that they're trying to record. People will find it easier to record simple homogeneous habitats than sort of complex mosaics, or where there's gradual transitions. And similarly, if habitats can be recorded accurately and with confidence. Often, one of the things that we find from our feedback from our volunteers is that sometimes they can struggle with definitions and having the confidence to know what a particular habitat description might incorporate. And if they don't feel confident, then they're much less likely to enjoy it and much less likely to participate. So we can sum up these things in a series of questions, the answers to which should help determine whether a particular way of recording habitat is suitable for citizen science or not. So firstly, how clear is the question? Is it sort of targeted at a specific set of species or environmental drivers? Is there a testable hypothesis behind it? Is there a clear rationale for why the volunteers might record it? Have the volunteers been engaged? Have their experiences been referred to perhaps when drawing up the schema? Obviously, if the schema sort of reflects what people are likely to see and do in the field, then they're much more likely to be they're much more likely to sort of buy into it. how much additional effort is required? Is it going to take away from their primary focus of recording, or whatever it is they're doing? Does it require extra visits? Any sort of extra effort that is going to be required is going to be a sort of a barrier to overcome to participation, and that might include things like even simple things like if you have to take a key or a sort of a field guide out with you and then have to work through that. That's an extra barrier to people participating. What is the scale of the sampling? And this relates back to how easy it is to relate to, or how easy it is to record. Single point features such as the presence of dead wood, or perhaps the sort of the habitat at the single point that you are standing is much easier to transcribe than if you're having to sort of partition out a whole visual field into possibly many different elements. Similarly, the complexity of the protocol. How readily recognizable is the feature, and how much prior experience or knowledge do you have to know to be able to record the feature? Things like cereal crops, for instance, it can be quite difficult for people to distinguish between different crop types, especially early in the growing season, when the sort of the features might be less obvious. And equally, if people have to sort of decide between whether a habitat fits into, or a habitat feature fits into one category or another category, that can cause quite a lot of concern for them. And often things about habitat condition, like is grassland improved or unimproved, can be quite daunting for volunteers who haven't had prior experience of recording such things. And then finally, what are the participants' motivations? I mentioned this earlier, but I think it's important that the sort of the aims of the recording align with what the participants want if we're going to get sort of wide-scale take-up. So we can summarize. I'm trying to sort of summarize all of those different aspects into sort of a simple biplot, if you like, with the main features being the sort of the effort required along the x-axis, and the complexity or the sort of the knowledge required for recording up here on the y-axis. And I think the first thing we have to note is that some habitat recording just is unlikely ever to be really suitable for sort of wide-scale citizen science. So things like recording detailed condition of habitat, knowing whether grassland is improved or unimproved, or things like that might actually be quite tricky for sort of most people to engage with. But below that, I think there's a gradient of activities that people can engage with, and their willingness to do so will sort of depend on the amount of effort that's required. So does it fit in easily with the existing recording pattern, and is there sort of a simple, well-defined recording schema, if you like, when people will be quite willing to participate, through to the sort of the schemas that perhaps require more effort, or sort of more detailed or more complex scoring schemes. So one example might be the sort of the BBS Habitat recording. So although people are supposed to make an initial visit to before they do the bird survey to record habitat, many don't, and record habitat as they are recording the birds. So it sort of fits within a recording pattern. There's quite a detailed scoring system relating to lots of different habitats, but these are sort of relatively clearly laid out, and most people are willing to do it. And we can put some numbers on that in this chart, which basically shows the number of BBS squares over the length of the run of the survey from when we started in 1994 all the way up to, goes up to 2015. And the sort of the green bars at the bottom are the number of squares where we don't, the number of squares submitted which didn't have habitat data associated with them. And you can see in the early days that that number of proportion was quite low. The people who were getting involved in BBS were sort of really motivated and were happy to sort of take on that extra burden of habitat recording. But as we expanded the numbers and sort of perhaps expanded the pool of volunteers that we were using, you can see that the proportion of squares that were submitted without habitat data increased, indicating that this was something that people perhaps didn't want to do naturally, and they required a bit of extra motivation or a bit of extra encouragement to do it. And in the end, what happened when we moved to an online system, we made habitat recording mandatory. So pretty much everybody had to do it. There are still a few submissions coming on paper, I suspect. So people will bird surveyors will record habitat, but I think this graph shows that it's something that they require a bit of extra motivation, a bit of extra encouragement to do. Similarly, we can think about recording for some other schemes. So recording for the sea, we had some habitat recording for the constant effort scheme. And this recording was quite detailed. It required people to measure vegetation heights either side of nets. It required them to sort of look at record the percentage cover of different species or different species groups. And even though those were fairly simple, a lot of recorders found it really quite difficult to do. Was something 50% or was it 55%? People got quite sort of concerned about recording accurately, and it really was sort of quite unpopular, and to the extent that eventually we dropped it. So that was sort of perhaps the limit of what even dedicated volunteers might do. We taught mostly in terms of habitat, but of course the same sorts of principles apply to recording other features other than those that people are primarily recording. So for instance, we've had some success with BBS surveyors recording butterfly transects. So although the recording is sort of relatively straightforward and relatively well defined, it does require extra visits. It can't be done during the sort of the BBS visits, of course, because it's sort of it requires a different timing. So again, we see sort of only partial take up of that. But I think sort of trying to fit different ways of scoring habitat into this plot is sort of quite informative in terms of the sorts of pulling out the sort of the general patterns for what volunteers will and will not do. And I'd be really keen if we could sort of put a couple more examples, and perhaps sort of non-bird examples particularly, onto this plot. So during the discussion session, I'd encourage you to, if you have sort of specific examples of where people have tried to record habitat successfully or not, to share those with us. So in terms of the breakout sessions, which I think we're going to go into now, there's a number of questions that we'd sort of quite like you to consider, which are sort of interlinked. The first is sort of why is recording habitat important to you? And I'm recognizing that different people associated with different groups will have different reasons for recording habitat, and will have different ideas of what the most important aspects of habitat are. And I'd really like to capture some of those. Whether that's, I'm thinking about sort of which are the most important features. Which are the most important features? Is it sort of particularly structure? Whether that's sort of vertical or horizontal? Is it specifically the vegetation type, so the sort of the species compositions, or is it some particular features in the landscape, such as the presence of deadwood or sorts of sunny hollows or whatever it might be? And is it really important to have sort of habitat sort of aligned with biodiversity records, whether those are sort of point or transects, or is sort of thinking about the sort of the larger, possibly the landscape scale context more important? So is it the difference between farmland and woodland, or is it really the importance of sort of 30% grassland versus 70% bracken or whatever? And recognizing that for any particular question, these things are likely to differ, but I'm sort of wondering whether there are any general points we should be pulling out. I think it's worth considering briefly, are volunteers the best way to record habitat? Are there sort of remote sense solutions? I mean, these are increasingly becoming more accessible and more available, but I think frequently still they require sort of ground truthing and calibration. They're not yet a panacea for recording all the sorts of habitats that on all the sorts of habitat features that we might be most interested in. And finally, I'd be really interested in hearing about sort of ways in which you people have sort of tried to record habitat in the past, and how well this went. Did scheme participants like or enjoy it, or did they find it difficult? And particularly where we've sort of got a bit of numerical evidence for that. One of the outcomes from this piece of work will be a paper sort of summarizing our thinking, and I'm very happy for people sort of beyond myself and Michael and Ailey to join in on that if they're interested in it, and I'll sort of perhaps ask people for to express interest a bit later on. But it would be good to include some sort of specific examples in that if we can.
We're now going to move on to the next section of this event, which is hearing from Michael Pocock on his work on volunteer retention and participation in citizen science.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Thanks ever so much as well for all of your contributions and discussions about the question of habitat recording. It's something that clearly we talked about it quite specifically within the view of the sort of TEPoP volunteers, but potentially it's the sort of thing which could, if deemed valuable, could go a lot more widely, and it might be something that you might argue, well, I suppose it's arguable, but you might say that there's less skill required to identify grassland than there is to identify a dunnock or something like that. So that's part of the context of why we were talking about this as well. So thank you for your contributions. Across the TSDA project, there's a wide range of different research and things that we're working on, and this is a report about one of the others, which is talking about participation and retention in what I broadly called citizen science. So across the wide range of citizen science, there have been quite a lot of project evaluations, so that's quite maybe not as common as it should be, but it's something that is done. A project will run and then there will be some sort of evaluation, which might be quite formal, or it might be just very informal, so that you learn as you go along. And these sorts of evaluations are really valuable for learning and for sharing experience. And some of them have included evaluation of different aspects to do with retention and persistence. And here I've shown 3 published examples of this. The Evolution Megalab, where they showed numbers of people involved in different projects. This lovely paper by Julia Parish in PNAS, I'd highly recommend this. But they looked at persistence over years. And then there was another paper here talking about pollinator recording in France and Korea. And they looked at numbers of people involved in different projects for different lengths of time. So these are all really valuable. But one of the things that we don't really have is a synthesis of knowledge on participation and retention across a wide range of projects. I think that's valuable because we can then learn from others' experience. We can identify, hopefully, areas of best practice, the things that really enhance participation and enhance retention or persistence across projects. It also means that we can have a degree of baselining of our expectations. So it might be, well, if I'm doing this type of citizen science, I would normally expect 50% of people to remain engaged next year, and I'm getting only 40. What can I do better? And it saves me having unrealistic expectations. And it also potentially allows us to use citizen science more as a tool. Well, what I know is that I need 100 data points or 1,000 data points. How many people do I need to try and get involved in order to get to that number? So within this project, what we did is we considered field-based and I suppose broadly nature-based citizen science. And I've used that term in quotes in my slides so far, simply because it includes the mass participation, the sort of thing which everyone would agree is citizen science, all the way through to the structured monitoring, which is often the sort of thing done by people who are reasonably expert and often will be involved in some of the structured recording, such as done through TEPoP. I know that some people don't like calling that citizen science, and that's fine, but just for convenience, if you go with it with me for now. So as I said, there's this broad range of what I've called citizen science, all the way from the structured through to back to the unstructured, the sort of thing where you can go out, make a record at any time, whenever you want. And so what we did was we worked with the British Ecological Society and put a call out for people to participate in a workshop and to bring data on their projects. And so we got a wide range of people from a really wide range of institutions, and we ended up with data on 39 diverse projects. And thanks also to Tom August and Francesca Mancini from UKCH for help with some of the analysis and discussion around this. So what were we interested in when thinking about participation? Well, we were interested in three different things. The first was the progression through stages of a project. The second was persistence or retention across years in a project. And the third was participation inequality. So the first thing that we needed to do, though, before we got into all of that, was say, well, we've got these 39 projects. They're all diverse. But what we want to do is try and summarize that diversity according to different attributes, and attributes which make sense in terms of the question of participation and retention. So we looked at the sorts of different ways in which projects have been analysed, or sorry, classified in the past, and we came up with these three broad groupings. The first was about the degree of promotion that the projects invested in. The thing about that is when we think about promotion, and promotion is important because we can change that. We can, within a project, we can put more effort and more focus on promotion. Maybe the balance of promotion versus retention. We might want continuous promotion, things like that. So that's something that we can change. The second thing was about the ease of participation. So this was my way of describing basically that spectrum from mass participation through to structured monitoring. And so if it's easy, then you don't need much expertise. There's not all that much effort that's required, or at least it's not essential. You can take part anywhere and you don't need to go back. And obviously the converse is true for the not easy to participate in. Why is that important? Well, actually, maybe that's less important because there's something which is quite structural about those sets of attributes to the project design. So if you're doing structured monitoring, well, you can't really change these attributes all that much, but it's important to take part or take account of it. And finally, the thing which maybe we can change most or invest most in is the idea of engagement. So we looked at the amount of personalised feedback, the summary feedback that's given. Do you give your volunteers a glossy brochure as to what the status is at the end of the year, for instance? We looked at social forums, the presence of social forums, and data exploration tools. So broadly, these are the things we looked at. So the first of the three, this is the longest of the three sections, is talking about progression through a project. So what we needed to do was actually define the stages of progression. And this is the sort of thing which hopefully as you look down this, it will become completely, or it will be completely obvious to you. It's like, yeah, well, that's obvious. Those are the stages of progression through a project. But we actually had to invest quite a lot of work to come up with something that hopefully is quite obvious. So you go from that initial reach, I've read about it in the paper, I've read about it online, whatever, through to that engagement with a project. You visit a website or you download an app, you register, you participate, and then we've got these stages of different levels of participation. So you participate more than once, you participate in more than 1 year, and you participate lots is the shorthand, but that's where you participate more than once in more than 1 year. And then there's an eighth one, which is a real sort of interesting collection of additional activities that people may or may not be able to do as part of your project. And so this is where there should be a little trumpet blast, because this is the first presentation of these results. Now, I know it's horrible to say this, I don't expect you to be able to read all the project codes, although probably some of you are scanning down to see where your project lies on this. The thing is that obviously all the projects decline in terms of the number of people who participate in these different stages. And the number of participants on the left-hand side is on a log scale, so it goes from 10 up to 1 million. Those are the numbers shown there. So you can see that there are certain projects which are very, very popular in terms of have lots of people involved, and there are others which have far fewer. Once we summarize it, that black line is the sort of average level of participation, and the numbers along the bottom show the percentage of people who engage or remain engaged from one stage to the next. So of those people who we reach, it's estimated 4% of them will engage with the project in some way. Of those who engage by visiting a website or downloading an app, 15% of them will go on to register. So broadly, what you've got is you've got about 1 in 100 who are reached engaged, 1 in 10 who engage register, about half of those who register participate, and then you sort of go down at 50% of the time, step by step. There's a different way of looking at that, which is looking at it all relative to this stage of participation. And the thing about this is that almost every project had data, well, every project did have data on the level of the number of people who participate at least once in the project. Actually, as we look backwards at reach, engage and register, we have many projects which didn't have that data. So we can sort of set everything relative to that. And so these are figures which actually is the first time that anyone's tried to bring together these data or these figures from a wide range of different projects in order to look at those changes. And just in terms of conclusion, some of the things which we found during this project is, firstly, those very early stages on reach and engagement are often not captured. They're often really difficult to capture, particularly reach. Some people offered estimates, but they were sort of possibly verging on the wild guesses. So it's really hard to do that. Maybe it would be valuable to try and understand that a bit more. And clearly with reach, it's quite tricky, simply because you get mentioned in a newspaper that's got a readership of 250,000. Does it mean that your reach was 250,000? Well, probably not. But maybe there's a whole load we can learn through that. The later stages are captured as records in databases, so that's much more straightforward. We did look at the different aspects of the different attributes of the projects, and what we found was it was only one stage was affected by any of those attributes, and that's that those who participate in more than 1 year. And if you have structured monitoring, you've got a much higher chance of people participating in more than 1 year, which is not surprising. That makes sense, because You've been very straightforward as people sign up to the project that you'd like them to participate in more than 1 year. And then this sort of extra category at the end, doing something extra, is extremely variable. The second thing that we looked at was participation across time. Now, this comes with a massive health warning because this is very preliminary data that we've only just been able to analyse. But we looked at the retention of people across time using Kaplan-Meier's survival analysis, and that produces these declining curves in terms of the overall survival probability from the start of somebody involved in that red line in breeding bird survey for up to 25 years. And there are many projects which have a lot less. Well, we looked at this in a slightly different way. As I say, this comes with a big health warning, and there are some potential problems with this data which need resolving with some of those who participated in the workshop. So if you see this in the future and the results are different, that explains why. But what it seems to be is that annual persistence appears to be really quite variable across projects. It's lower in the first year, from the first year to the second year, than subsequent years. So it tends to be lower. There tends to be quite a drop off of people after the first year, whereas thereafter it seems to be consistently higher. And the variability in participation across time seems to relate to higher levels of engagement. So if a project invests a lot in the engagement, those different things that I talked about, feedback to people, it appears that the participation or the persistence is higher, which is valuable to know. And again, maybe it's not surprising, but this is the first time this has been shown with data like this. And then the third aspect which I was talking about was participation inequality. And that bubble plot you can see on the left there shows the number of people submitting records to iNaturalist up to the end of 2017. The size of the circle is the size, or is related to the number of records which they've submitted. So you can see that there's this massive, great big haze all the way around the edge of people who submit very, very few records, and then you get fewer and fewer people as you get to the bigger bubbles in the middle. So why is participation inequality important? Well, it seems to be important. I think it's important for a couple of reasons. One is because it might be that there are particular barriers to people's involvement in citizen science that is important to consider. It might be things like time or money. It might be that there are particular demographics which are important for us to consider, which may possibly be barriers which are stopping people having higher levels of involvement and participation. The second thing is that higher levels of participation do provide greater opportunity for things like learning. It's probably indicative of higher expertise and possibly higher quality of those records. It could lead to much greater spatial biases in the data set. It could lead to longer term participation. It's like one of the easiest ways of having a large number of records, or being able to submit a large number of records, is being active in the project over a large number of time. And it could be that these people are also getting greater benefits themselves in terms of connecting with nature and things like that. So there's a few reasons why this is important. Now, I'll talk you through this graph, because if you rank cumulative share from lowest to highest contributors, and on the x-axis, and you rank the cumulative share of records on the y-axis, you end up with curves which can look like these green, orange or red curves. And this is the sort of thing that's typically seen when you're plotting things like inequality of wealth globally and various things like this. A lot of them will show, lots of those distributions will show curves like this. And so that can be summarized as, for example, if you take this top bit here marked A, What we're interested in, or one of the things that we might be interested in, is how many people contribute 80% of the records. Is it like this red line, 20% of the people contribute 80% of the records, in which case it's really quite unequal? Or is it like this green line where it's very, very equal and 80% of people contribute 80% of records? So those are the sorts of things, and this can be summarised as the 80-20 rule or the 90-9-1 rule, with things that you might have heard. Rather handily, this can be summarised in terms of the Gini coefficient, and the Gini coefficient is basically the difference between the green line, this one-to-one line, and the curve that you're interested in. So if you lie on that green line, Gini coefficient is 0 because there's no difference. If you lie on this red line, then the Gini coefficient heads towards 1 as it gets further and further into the corner. And so what we did was we looked at all of those projects and we plotted the participation inequality. And that's what this looks like for these 39 projects. And so you can see these are ranked from the most equal projects up at the top, with the Blimmin' Algae app, Earthworm Watch and various others up here, all the way through to the most unequal projects, iSpot, iRecord and the French project SPIPOL down at the bottom. So what we can see is, firstly, we need to be mindful of the fact that the unit of participation is not equal across these projects. It might be that it's one snapshot or 1 year's worth of transects. So that's something that we need to be careful of in terms of interpreting this. But there seems to be maybe some of these projects up at the top, these mass participation projects, there's possibly less incentive to record lots. Something like Blimmin' Algae, you might record that you've got an algal bloom on your pond, and there's no incentive to record lots more, because you've recorded it already. Down at the other side, at the other end, things like iSpot and iRecord, there's lots of opportunity to record lots and lots and lots and keep going. And obviously structured monitoring sits somewhere in the middle, so there actually isn't much more opportunity to record lots more under the National Plant Monitoring Scheme or the Breeding Bird Survey, unless you take on more and more and more transects. And so what we did here is we ranked the projects by their Gini coefficient. Remember, that's that difference between the curve and the diagonal line. And that dotted line shows this roughly 80-20 rule. So there are some projects which are far more unequal up at the top with a high Gini coefficient, and there are many projects which are more equal than you might expect under the 80-20 principle. And what we generally found was that projects with greater inequality or a higher Gini coefficient tended to have had more people involved, and they tend to have more records per person. They tend to be easier to participate in. And as I said, structured monitoring seems to sort of cap the level of participation by design. And also they tend to have much higher levels or higher degrees of engagement. So I wonder if this is this greater opportunity to support the super recorders and enable those people who are moderate recorders to get more and more and more into it. So I think this it could be something about whether we are actively supporting the enthusiasts or taking them on, or whether we're simply allowing those people who are super keen recorders simply to flourish within our project. So that's basically the end of my talk. So we've shown the synthesis of participation and retention across 39 projects. This is the first time this has been showed across a large number of projects. So hopefully, well, I think most of it looks pretty obvious, but it's really exciting to actually have this summarised in this way. First overview of retention across stages, and we're really affected by this limited amount of data on early stages in projects. Second one, this persistence across years. It looks like there's a sort of entry effect or an entry filter. So if you can keep people more than 1 year, you've probably got them for quite a few years, and that seems to be consistent across many of the projects. And then this participation inequality seems to be strongly affected by the design of the project. All of this is valuable as we think about this, hopefully this virtuous circle of citizen science feeding into this production of data, which is useful for analysis, which builds onto action, but of course also the benefits that recorders get from doing this in terms of their engagement with nature, benefits on well-being in terms of being part of a group, and all the other aspects as well. And the final thing, which I should have put in this presentation, but I didn't, is in about 3 or 4 weeks' time, we've got a meeting hosted by the British Ecological Society, and I think this is, notice of this is going to come out in the TEPoP bulletin, where we're drawing on a wide range of people, talking about retention, coming from marketing, design, usability, social science. There's going to be a wide range of experts coming to shed light on some of these things to help us improve our projects. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thanks very much for that, Michael. That was a really good summary of the work, and really interesting to see how those sort of distributions are spreading out. First question here, just to encourage everybody else to pop questions into the meeting chat whenever you like now. We've got a question regarding super volunteers. What to do next depends on whether aim is to get more data or engage more people and make it more inclusive, etc. Any comments on that, Michael?
Yeah, I agree. I think this is one of the things about citizen science in the broadest aim. I completely agree with David. We have so many different, as organisers, we have so many different motivations, don't we? And we talked about this on one of the previous workshops about inclusivity and diversity within our schemes and the reason we might want to do that. And clearly we recognise that there are benefits that we gain from being involved in being outside, recording nature, doing these worthwhile activities as well. So yeah, sharing that aspect is really important. So yeah, very much agree with David.
Great. And a further comment from James here. It would be useful to know what information different schemes hold on their volunteers to drill into these results further. I think you had some of the schemes involved in this project, didn't you, Michael?
Yes, yes, absolutely. So thank you ever so much to everyone on this call who was involved in those workshops and has shared data. That's brilliant. Yeah, and so what we chose to do is primarily look at a project level rather than a volunteer level. And I think James's comment goes back to that TEPoP workshop we had a couple of weeks ago talking about diversity and some of those challenges. I think many schemes have not collected information about their volunteers. I suppose primarily because they haven't needed to, and therefore under questions like GDPR, we shouldn't be collecting information on our volunteers, but actually maybe as we want to discover more and more about being inclusive, we do need to have some of this baseline data. So I think in most cases, James, most projects don't have information on the demographics of their volunteers.
And I think the framework that you've sort of developed here in terms of the ways of looking at the retention through a project is a quite nice one for schemes to sort of think about it going forward, isn't it, in terms of analysing the data on participation that they may be able to collect in future.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've had a comment here. We're looking to engage more young people in our citizen science work. Are you able to cut your data by age demographic and any significant differences? Presumably the answer to that is no, based on what you just said. Is that... Yeah,
absolutely. I imagine Nick was typing that as I was speaking, which is fine. Yeah, and I agree with you, Niki, that it does clearly, thinking of the 3 sets of analyses that we've done, you could then cut that by all sorts of demographics and begin to say, well, actually within our project or within these different types of projects, what is the retention of people? Maybe things like age or socioeconomic status might be particularly key ones that we might be interested in looking at.
We've had a comment from Teresa. There's a bit of an irony in the more accessible / low barrier recording opportunities, iSpot and iRecord being more unequal than the skilled structured schemes, because by their nature there's a limit of how much one person can contribute. Perhaps a different terminology is needed.
Yeah, thank you, Teresa. Good point. Yes, okay. I will ponder that. Yes, because actually, yeah, it's like using the word bias, isn't it? Bias, unequal. There's sort of they come with various connotations, which may not be the connotations that you intended when you used them. So I expect that most people here have. I hope that most people here have understood what I was meaning by that. But yes, thank you, Teresa.
Yes, you can get into a terminology minefield. I was thinking the points around using the word citizen science were, from a diversity point of view, we've had it pointed out that we shouldn't use citizen, we should use community, because it excludes people who aren't citizens. And it was a whole other way of thinking about it. So yes, terminology can be a bit of a minefield. So we've had a question. Do you have any ideas for quick win recommendations for schemes at this stage based on the results?
Yeah, I'll just come back to that point about community science. One of the challenges is that community science means something quite specific to at least certain communities as well.
Yeah.
So yeah,
it's very difficult, isn't it?
If there was a better term than citizen science, I think many people would have started using it by now, because it's received a bit of a kickback. But anyway, I sort of view it as a term of convenience that we've got for the moment.
Yeah.
In terms of the quick wins, yeah, I was surprised that some of the attributes that we were looking at didn't come out as stronger, and it's made me stronger in terms of explaining some of the effects that we saw. Now there are a few, and it seems that giving people feedback is something that's really positive in terms of participation and retention of volunteers, which maybe is not at all, oh sorry, is not unexpected. But that's something that obviously is important. So then the other question is why weren't there more things that came out as really important predictors of participation and retention? And I suspect that it's because there is something much more specific about many of these attributes with regards to specific projects. So there needs to be a lot more contextualizing of the specific aspects, which then leads to how we get that right balance between having the sorts of evaluations which are so project specific that it might take a fair bit of translation in order to say, well, here's something general I can learn about designing my project or improving, enhancing my particular project, versus things that are so general that actually end up being too general that they can't explain things well. And it might be that we've actually ended up trying to generalize a little bit too much, but as soon as we tried to be more specific, what we ended up doing was not being able to include as many projects. So I think there's some really interesting questions there and further work to be done.
Great, thanks very much. And just finally, many thanks. I hope you've all enjoyed these events.